So wow, thank you so much, and thank you, Avi. You saved me a lot of words. And I really want to offer a very, very warm welcome to all the people here to the first conference that celebrates the creation of IRMaM, the Interdisciplinary Research Center in Music and Mind. And our goals are to understand creativity and to develop new tools that will help with augment creative expression, unleash the creativity that we have in us. And these are extremely, extremely challenging and complicated goals. By all measure, these are grand challenges. So, for this conference, we invited 3 key disciplines, and in no particular order: neuroscientists, software engineers, and musicians, composers, theorists, and so on. And our hope is, our sincere hope is that by us working together, and I emphasize together, we'll find a common language, and we'll be able to develop a really deep understanding of this big picture so that we can effectively, as a team, effectively tackle these problems. Tackle them creatively. And before I start, I really want to give a very, very special warm thanks to the Bar-Ilan and to the music department, to Avi Gilboa, to Eitan, to Shai, to Vital Hollander from the Michlala. It was really unconditional support, and not only that, also creative support, because it was a very interesting personal journey for all of us to go from wherever it is we started to where we ended here. So if I have to say what IRMaM is about in one word, and use just one word, I'd say creativity. Everybody likes creativity, but the truth is that nobody understands it. And even worse, no one can even agree on what it means. But we all agree that creativity is one of the key things that defines us as human. So, good for creativity. But at least for where we are now, it is way, way too ambitious, and we're going to narrow it down. So, augment creative expression. And what the hell does that mean? So let me give you an example. Let's say that you're writing a book, or an essay, or a story, or even a letter to a friend. What would you do? You'd use a word processor, right? It's great. It's got cut, copy, paste, find, replace, format, all those great things. Now, if you think about it, this really isn't about helping you with creativity. It's helping you with what I'd call productivity. When you write a story or a book, you have characters. These characters have a personality. Then you're trying to work out a plot where these characters interact with each other in some way that makes sense. And you probably have some idea that you want the reader to get through to the reader. It's these sort of things that we're talking about, helping you with this part of the process that we call augmenting creative expression, or unleashing your expressive ability to be able to deal with these sorts of problems. And we're going to focus specifically on music, so augment creative expression in music. And that's great because the mind naturally creates music. People create music all over the world. And when people hear music, they know how to listen to that music and generate from it a musical experience. Everywhere in the world. It's innate. Our brain is just built to do that. So there's a question. If our mind can naturally create music, why do we need tools to help it do it? So one answer, yes, we can create, but only in small chunks. There's some limitation of our mind, and we can create small chunks of music. So, well, nobody can create an entire symphony in his head, not even Beethoven. Beethoven was working on his Fifth Symphony, pa-pa-pa-pam. Took him, I think, 2 or 3 years to get this together. So what was going on there? It's sort of just like writing a story. You have all these characters, you have all these ideas that come in chunks, you have all these motives, and you need to work them out into what I'm going to call a musical structure. That if it's classical music, and I'm emphasizing classical music because in other styles it's different, it ends up in a score. We're talking about things like motivic development, treatment of polyphony and counterpoint, harmonic progressions, orchestrations, all those sorts of things. And it is damn complicated. It takes a lot of time to do that. We go through many, many iterations in the working out from this idea that we have into the music structure. And if that was the problem, great. But actually, the music structure is really just a byproduct, because there's something much more important that's driving the creative process. And what's driving the creative process is just some musical experience that's in the composer's mind. For example, I want to write a happy symphony that's going to celebrate the creation of IRMaM. So I have some experience in my mind, and now I know I need to get this experience to drive everything that I'm doing that will end up in the structure. And this is really, really hard. Even Beethoven couldn't get this right in this Fifth Symphony. Pa-pa-pa-pam, pa-pa-pa-pam, pa-pa-pa-pam. And he says, stop, first rehearsal, stop, stop, stop. The experience that I'm getting is not the experience that I wanted. And he jumped on stage and he changed the structure. He added another measure. After the fourth measure, made it longer so that the experience he got fit the experience that he wanted. So it's the composer's musical experience that's driving all this working out of the structure. And it's the whole complication of an experience as a composer that I want, working out the structure through whatever this experience tells me, and then listening to the music as it's performed, which is actually the domain, the effect of what I do when I organize the structure on the domain, which is music. When it comes back, it generates my musical experience. And to make it very, 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 very simple, the problem is for the composer to get what he wants. And it's a totally, totally non-trivial problem. So if I have to summarize augment creative expression in music, it's all these things that we were talking about here. Okay, so how do we get there? We definitely need an approach. And there are many approaches that we could have taken. And the approach that we chose is to look at the mind in relationship to the music. To understand the mind's natural capabilities in generating music, in generating the musical experience, in relationship to music, and I guess that means as we understand it through music theory. And now that we have this approach, we want to do something that's really difficult. We want to develop an understanding. And what sort of things may we want to understand? And I'm going to go bottom up from the bottom. If there is music and the mind generates it, what are the generative building blocks that the mind uses? What are the generative mechanisms or syntax that puts these blocks together that we come up with a coherent structure? And then, if we go higher up, what is the musical experience? How does it relate to the structure? How does it relate to the blocks? And then there's this extremely enigmatic things that we sort of talk about, but no one knows really what it means, which is context. What is context? How does it relate to the experience? How does it relate to the structure? And from there we can go on to things that we more readily associate with creativity, like the actual music creation, the act of creating and performing music. And this leads us to augmenting expression. Now, Once we have this understanding, and it is totally, totally, totally not trivial to get there, but once we get there, we could do something that at least I consider a lot of fun. We could pull back, and we could start thinking and envision, if we had these understandings, what new things could we give composers so that they could do with music? A vision. So, for instance, things like that. If we understood the musical experience, maybe we could let a composer directly express it. There isn't one tool, mechanism, system, or anything that I'm aware of that lets a composer deal on the level of the experience itself. And of course not, because no one really knows what the experience is, let alone what the experience in your head is. It's complicated, we'll talk about that, but that's one possibility. If we're talking about generative syntax, understanding it, well, can we use it to help work out structure? And it's not only structure. If I make a change somewhere in the structure, I change a note, I change a phrase, I change whatever. Can I understand what the generative implications are on the structure? Things like that. Generative building blocks, and we'll see that they have extremely unique generative potentials. We'll talk about that quite a bit. How can we understand that? How can we leverage them? How can we use that for creating music transformations and so on and so on? Context, it might be a key for depersonalization, which means if I'm using a tool and you're using the same tool and we sort of use it at the same settings, I'm my person, you're a different person, we both have different wants and personalities and so on. It doesn't make sense that the same tool will give the same music. I want my tool to give my music, to present my thumbprint, and I assume the other composer would want the same. So this kind of depersonalization, how can we get there? And of course, augmenting expression. So once we have this vision, and I'm not saying that this is the right vision, this is just a vision of a possible vision, now comes the really, 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 really hard work, because what we need to do from here is develop the, I would call, new predictive models or theories of understanding that would actually enable them. And these are huge, huge challenges to many, many disciplines. Certainly cognitive neuroscience, certainly computational musicology, data science, deep learning, computational linguistics, and many more. It's a huge problem. But if we have these models, we could then go into technology and start creating tools that use such models to help composers augment their creative expression. And of course, we could give these tools to composers. We could see what is new in the music that they create. But from the big picture, we have scientists, engineers, and artists all working together towards a far end goal of hopefully we can crack creativity sometime not too far from now. So IRMaM is built around 3 core disciplines: scientists, engineering, and art, and thanks, Savi, for talking about that. There are many more disciplines. We have here some presentations. And from science, of course, we want the new generative models and all that science, which in itself would be a huge contribution. But if we think about the collaboration, at least 2 more things really important will come out of that. First of all, an understanding, a creation, an understanding of a big picture. So if I'm working on this, I see that I fit there, and he's working on that, he fits there, and we actually relate to each other, and we should talk, or it's close. And we can also see gaps. This and this is missing, so perhaps it excites someone to come and help and fill it up. And also through these concepts that come out with this big language, I hope that we can create a common language. If there's one thing I learned in over 20 years in IBM, you have 2 disciplines talking to each other almost about the same thing, saying almost the same thing, but they totally don't understand the other because they're using words that are slightly different. So a common language. And then, of course, there's the engineering, which its main mission is to create this new technology, and it will receive these models from the scientist and hand it to the artist. And when we talk about art in this context, I want to make a switch. Art is subjective and it's all about being unique and creating a new art and all that. But in our scenario of collaboration, I want us all to look at the artist as our empirical test ground. If I have a new model that I'm testing, or if I'm building a new component in engineering and I want to test it out, our musicians will be there ready to do any tests that's needed to help verify this model. And what's critical is that every discipline not only talks and learns from the other, but also feeds back into the other. So it's a collaboration going both sides with feedback, and we'll see that feedback is critical, and I'm just coining this as creative collaboration. So this is IRMaM, and now we can start talking about some of the challenges. And the first challenge I want to talk about is what I call the dialectic of music and mind. We sort of think of one as objective and one as subjective and who knows what, and they work together or they don't work together, they're different. Think of it dialectically. One is a synthesis, one is an anti-synthesis, one is a thesis, one is an antithesis. What we want is the synthesis. Then the synthesis of them both together, the yin and yang, because they both are part of the same thing and complement each other and help us arrive at the truth or figure out our problem. So let's take a look at this. In Western classical music, and I'm emphasizing Western classical music because in other cultures or styles it would be very different, you have a composer that through some divinity creates a new masterpiece. That masterpiece is manifested in a score. The score is given to an orchestra, the orchestra performs, in this case, maybe 3,000 people in the hall. And I want to ask a question. In these four pictures, where is the music? Just where is it? Is it here, 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 or there? So it depends who you ask. If you ask a music theorist, and I'm basing this on my many years of learning music theory, the music theorist would say in the score. Because all our theory from Fuchs up to the latest generative theory of tonal music, all the theory always points back to the score. Everyone knows that there are other things going on. There's emotions and there's things in the mind, but it's all about the score. Everything the theory shows is in the score. You want to check something, you go to the score. So the score is, from a theory perspective, the single source of truth, unequivocal. On the other hand, if you ask a cognitive neuroscientist, he'll give you a very different answer. He'll say music is only in the brain. Only in the brain. It's an experience, which means each and every one of us has his experience. It's extremely subjective. My experience is certainly not like yours experience. Moreover, if I hear the same piece and hear it the second time, I will more than likely have a different experience. I mean, why else listen to the piece again? So you have here two sort of opposing views of music that are really complementing. But now I'm going to sort of switch it. If here we see music as a single source of truth and the mind as something very subjective and fuzzy, I'm going to switch it. And let's look at music more globally all around the world. There is a huge, huge diversity across culture, across style, and of course, across individual composers. And we can talk about this for hours. Let's take the Japanese example. Let's just look at the shakuhachi flute player. In Western music, as a composer, when I think of flute, okay, I give him pitches. He has a pitch, and he plays the pitch, and I'm done. Shakuhachi, they have this whole thing of how do you get into the sound, into the pitch, and how do you maintain the pitch with all the little variation, and how do you get out of the pitch? So they're thinking about this feature that we call pitch in a completely different way. Sense of time. In Western music, it is extremely controlled, extremely well structured. Japanese music, At least to me, it sounds like it's more meditative, completely different experience. I start listening to the Japanese piece, I have no idea if it's going to be 2 minutes or 2 hours. Western music, a good musician usually within 10 seconds can sort of get, this is part of a symphony or just a 3-minute song or that, it's sort of obvious. So there are huge, huge, huge differences in music across culture and across style. And as far as I know, there isn't one theory that explains this, or what and if they do, it's all relative to Western music, which is maybe a little problematic. On the other hand, and this is a hypothesis that actually isn't too far-reached, the mind defines a universal generative principle, which means the mind has innate capability to generate music and to generate the experience, and all these different styles, all these different cases are instances. The same generative mechanisms takes place, but there are instances of this superset. And if you want to think about that's if you think about it in an object-oriented way, or if you want to say this superset constrains what happens in each individual instance, and of course any future music that we'll produce in IRMaM would fall under the same constraints. So you have here a completely opposite view in which the mind is what unifies and brings everything together. And if we just stop here, the huge, huge, huge challenging just to understand what is the mind universal generative mechanisms. I don't think anyone knows yet. We all know that they're there. We're looking for it. We're trying to figure out if it's here or there or what are the mechanisms, but what's actually going on there. Musical experience. I don't think anyone knows how it gets generated or what it really is. And how does that relate to the generative mechanisms that create it? I don't know if anyone knows. And from a music theory perspective, can we come up with sort of a more general theory that will explain all music and then see what's similar and differences and different across different instances of music? So these are huge challenges, and of course there are engineering challenges. If we talk about deep learning, are there different new ways of using deep learning that could help us learn some of these aspects? And I'm pretty sure they are. I have no idea what they are. And of course, once we understand that, to apply that to tools. So let's talk a little bit about generative mechanisms in music. Noam Chomsky in about 60 came out with his universal generative grammar, and he said a certain set of structural rules are innate to all humans, which means we're all born with the ability to generate and understand language. That comes naturally. And he pointed out some of the system components, the primitives, phonemes, sounds that group up into words. And a word is a building block, and a building block meaning this is the smallest unit of meaning. And then there is a generative syntax that takes these lower level units of words or low level units of meanings, starting by words, and groups them into higher level units of meaning, higher and higher and higher, until we get to the top of the tree. So here the dog ate the bone. The dog is grouped into a noun phrase and so on up to the bone. And then we get the semantics or the meaning. And once we parse that sentence, yes, we have the meaning of the dog eating the bone. And Chomsky showed that the mind can create infinitely, using this mechanism, infinitely new sentences with completely new ideas that no one said. No one needs to learn grammar, like his famous colorless blue thoughts sleep furiously. Bernstein, in his unbelievable talk, The Unanswered Question, and if someone wants to learn deeper about music, I highly recommend them. They're all on YouTube. He said the same innate generative mechanisms that Chomsky demonstrated in language apply to music. The same sort of mechanism. He wasn't saying necessarily the same, that those in the mind, those are the same mechanism. And he ported, he said that there are significant differences between language and music. And we see here an analysis that he made that's showing this same sort of syntactic hierarchical tree of grouping lower level units of meaning, in this case motives and phrases, into phrases and so on. This was picked up by Lerdahl and Jackendorf, who created the generative theory of tonal music in '83. That is a monumental theory. It is qualitative. And you can do the same generative analysis of large sections of music. Here we see some analysis, but the point is that you see the same hierarchical grouping where lower levels of understandings group into higher level of understandings, and that's sort of the generative mechanism. Now, a lot has been said about similarities and differences between music and language, and I'm definitely not going to go there, but I'm going to point one, what I call fundamental generative difference, and that's in the building block. In language, we use a word, and in music, we use a motive. Remember Beethoven Fifth? Pa-pa-pa-pam. That's a motive, the smallest unit of meaning in language. So, in word, we have a fixed quantity. Motives, musical motives, unbound, always new, inspiration. I'm told that every day about 100,000 new songs are registered in a copyright database. That means that we have 100,000 new motives a day, because if one of those motives was the same, our ear is so sensitive to it that no question there'd be a copyright infringement right then and there. Meanings of words are clear or a small set. Motive is very unclear, but what's really, really important is the generative potential. The generative potential of words are understood, clear, small, or a small set of meanings. In music, it's completely unique, and it's important we understand that. So a musical building block has unique generative potentials, and what do I mean by that? So think again about an author writing a story, and we have this character. So there are several characters. The main character is called David, and we're going to give him some features. David is young, very smart, very successful, and all the girls love him. 4 features. And now I'm the author, and I'm writing this story, and there are other characters, and we start at elementary school, we go through high school, we go through college, early adulthood, and all that stuff, and all this relationship and plot is being built up. And suddenly, 6-9 months into the process, the author realizes, oh my God, David has one additional feature that I didn't realize. He really has it. And I'm going to name this feature, and I'm going to use a slightly extreme feature just to make the point. David is also a transgender. So if he's also a transgender, his personality is probably going to be very different. The way he reacts with other people in elementary school, high school, and all throughout is going to be very different. And more than likely, the whole, or huge chunks of this book are going to have to be rewritten. And let's see how this works in music. So you all know Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and by the way, I told you this is the measure that Beethoven added when he was at the first rehearsal. Couldn't get that right. So we're going to do an empirical experiment here, and we're going to change one feature, one really, really small feature. And we're going to take this. We're going to take this second 8 note and add a dot, which means we're going to lengthen it a little bit. And I asked Shai to play with it and see where this naturally takes him, and this is what Shai came up with. That did not work. I think we all experience that this music is very different. It doesn't have this drama and push that the Fifth has. It's sort of much more simple, light, maybe dance-like quality and all that. You experience that. And all music theory is talking about how that Beethoven's motive generated the whole piece. It is very clear that this cannot generate a for movement, symphony. This is a smaller, more contained dance. It doesn't matter why. What's important is that you experience this and that you understand that in music these generative potentials are extremely, extremely meaningful, not only to the experience, but also to the structure, to the generation. So we get here huge challenges again, and what are the relationship between the features and the blocks and the generative potentials, and between the blocks and the syntax and experience, and all those good things. Huge, hugely complicated problems. And here I'm going to make a leap of faith. And I'm going to talk about experience and context, and I'm going to bring in some things that I really know very little about. But think of this as just a first pass to start a discussion, and let's go from here. So the first music theory that I'm aware of that talked about the musical experience was Leonard Meyer in '56, in a book called Emotions and Meaning in Music. And he wrote that meaning is created by cycles of tension and relaxation that result from expectations that are either met or not. Now, that sounds very, very close to my understanding of some of the latest understandings in neuroscience. In 2004, Jeff Hawkins came out with his memory prediction framework that I was told at the time was the first top-down theory of how the mind works. And he said that all cortex modules, and here you see modules: touch, sensory, audition, and vision, and each one of these modules is grouped into many, many, many sub-modules, and more in their hierarchical structures going up and down. Each one of these modules, everywhere in the cortex, uses one and only one algorithm, the same algorithm, and this is more or less the algorithm that he came up with. And in this talk, I'm just going to refer to it as the fundamental cycle of the mind. And basically he says, we sense the real world, we try to identify what it is that we sense. Based on that identification, we make a prediction that probably affects our behavior. And then we observe our prediction. If it was right, fine. If it was wrong, we learn from it. And this cycle just goes on and on in parallel indefinitely. So I'm observing here a prediction that I made back then in the past. I'm asking my current experience to state what I identify. Is this prediction true? If no, we learn, and the result of learning is an update in memory, which means either updating existing memories or creating new memories that explain this new correlation. Let me give you a story. Let's say I'm walking in the woods and I hear behind me a rustle in the leaves. I want to know if it's a lion, because if it's a lion, it's probably I'm going to predict it's going to eat me, so I'm probably going to want to run away. Or if it's a rabbit, I might decide, hey, this could be a good dinner, and I might try and catch it. And I turn around, and it's my good friend. So both these predictions were wrong, we learn, so that next time when I hear that same rustle, I'll more than likely associate it with my friend, and things will be much simpler. So let's go back from here. Oh, so sorry. Let's talk from here on the musical experience, and this is very schematic. We're listening to music. There's some acoustic things going on. We go through some perception mechanisms. We go through some generative decoding. And then through some mechanism, somehow that I don't think anyone really understands yet, we get this musical experience. We know that the musical experience has several other mechanisms in the brain, like cognitive, emotional, visceral. It might want us to move and dance. And also other things like engagement, which I know Jonathan will talk about, and attention. But one thing that is really, really interesting about the experience is that it happens in this magical point in time that doesn't exist really anywhere except for the experience that is called now, the present. And this was pointed out by Johannes Goebbels, who is now the director of MPAC in Rensselaer Polytechnic. And if we look at science or physics, we look at the past, we try to identify a problem that interests us, we build a predictive model, we feed it input, and that model will tell us what's going to happen in the future. But the now isn't really there, except for our experience. So I'm making here two leaps of faith and proposing two hypotheses. First of all, that this fundamental cycle of the mind also exists in the now. And secondly, that this cycle actually shapes our experience. So you go back to Mayer, this is what's happening. We're listening to music and we say, okay, we're making a prediction, we're about to cadence. So somewhere in the future there's a cadence put up, and time passes, the now goes on and on in time, and at some point the now reaches the time where that prediction was, and we observe that prediction, and we ask our current, whatever, identify our current experience, is there a cadence now? Yikes, no, it's a false cadence. Okay, so we learn from that, there's a memory update, and I'm making here another claim. This memory update updates the context, and this context switch is what changes how we sense, identify, and predict, and therefore our experience changes. So our experience is also dynamic over time. So let's look at this context. And I'm proposing here an extremely simple model of mainly two modules. One I'm calling the personal context, and that is everything from my genetics, culture, education, everything from when I was born until now, before the music started. The music context is everything from when the music started until the now, and that is very dynamic. It's influenced by things like expectations and outcomes, and tension, relaxation, and so on and so on. So if we go back to Meyer, here's the yikes, false cadence. We learn there's a memory update, our experience at T, we have a context at T, the memory is updated at T, and that shapes how we identify and believe, or I'm putting here another hypothesis, this context actually switches the algorithms in these sense, identify, and predict mechanisms. Don't know how much of this is true, but kind of makes sense coming from a music perspective, and certainly from a technology perspective. I can see here huge contributions to models that we can build, and I think Dan Gang will talk about that tomorrow. So again, huge challenges. The experience is dynamic. What is the experience? What is a musical experience? How does it relate to the musical context? How does it relate to the personal context? Can the personal context explain things like changes in culture and style and things like that? And all those sort of things, and the big challenges, how the hell do we figure all this out? And there is one more thing I want to talk about, which is feedback. And if we go back to Hawkins, he said also that computation is hierarchical, and we see these same hierarchical structures that we saw in all the generative diagrams we saw before. But he also said that feedback is critical. And in fact, we know that the number of actions coming down from higher level units back down to the lower level units is far, far, far greater. And that's the feedback coming down. So let's say that I'm a low-level unit trying to identify shapes and line, and now I identify an object. I identify the nose. I send this up to the higher-level unit, which is, let's say, a face, and the face predict, well, if the eye saw a nose, probably the next thing you're going to see is an eye, so it says look for an eye. So when the eye now looks and it sees, when our eye now looks at somebody else's face and sees something round, it won't start considering, is this a golf course? There's a prediction that's already guiding him. And this is what Hawkins found is critical. And if we look at all the generative hierarchies and mechanisms that we've seen so far, they're very, very similar. And I think it's not surprising because probably that's just the way the mind works. But there is one fundamental difference between everything we saw before and Hawkins. Fundamental, that's missing in all of them, and that is the prediction and the feedback down. And I just feel that if we figure out this prediction and the feedback, we could go to a whole new modeling. If it's music theory, new predictive models of music and mind that could predict what would happen if I do something, that could predict, going back to the vision, if I make a local change, what would be affected globally, and things like that. And this is as far as I'm going here today. I'll be talking tomorrow about engineering problems. And the big question is, how do we get there? So I've raised tons and tons and tons of problems, from the generative mechanisms to building blocks to generative potentials to all that stuff. And how do we get there? So I can say two things about how do we get there. First of all, for me, the question, how do we get there, is very simple because I know the answer. And actually, Avi said it. I haven't a clue. But what I am confident is that if we do work on this together, collaboratively, we stand a really good chance of getting there. And therefore, this is IRMaM and the structure of IRMaM. And before I end, I just want to say one thing, that this is our first day. We're just really starting today, but already there has been a lot of input, support, even wanting to collaborate from many, many places, not only in Israel, but also around the world. So as a representative of IRMaM, I really want to offer everyone a very, very warm welcome. If any of these problems are interesting to you and you would like to work with us together, please come and join us. We absolutely welcome you. Thank you.